What if I told you that behind the silk curtains and marble fountains of the world's most famous harem lay a system of sexual slavery so brutal that it made medieval dungeons seem merciful by comparison? Everyone has heard the romanticized tales of the Ottoman harem, exotic beauties lounging in luxury, competing gracefully for the sultan's attention while living lives of pampered indulgence. The popular imagination pictures scented baths, flowing silks, and sensual dances performed for an all-powerful ruler in a paradise of earthly delights. But what if I told you that this fantasy was carefully constructed propaganda designed to hide one of history's most systematic campaigns of sexual exploitation and psychological terror? What if the reality behind those golden doors was so horrifying that even the Ottoman archives still conceal the darkest secrets more than a century after the empire's collapse? You've seen the Hollywood movies and read the romance novels about sultry harem girls living in oriental splendor. You might know about famous figures like Roxolana, who supposedly rose from slavery to become a sultan's beloved wife. But you don't know about the industrial-scale human trafficking that fed this system, the ritual mutilations performed on children, or the mass executions that occurred whenever a sultan died. Behind the myth of the Golden Cage lies a story of captivity so complete that it redefined the very concept of human bondage. The Ottoman harem wasn't just a collection of the sultan's wives and concubines. It was a factory for producing broken human beings whose only purpose was to serve male sexual fantasies and political ambitions. The women trapped in this system weren't pampered princesses competing for jewelry and attention. They were prisoners in a psychological experiment so sophisticated that it would impress modern cult leaders. For over 4 centuries, the Ottoman Empire perfected techniques for destroying human will, eliminating individual identity, and transforming kidnapped girls into willing participants in their own dehumanization. The most disturbing part? The system worked so well that many of its victims came to believe they were the fortunate ones. The harem produced women so thoroughly conditioned that they would kill to protect the very system that had destroyed their lives. They became willing executioners of other women, enthusiastic participants in sexual rituals that violated every concept of human dignity, and fanatical defenders of their own captivity. If you think you're ready to learn what really happened behind the walls of Topkapi Palace, subscribe to this channel and let me know in the comments what you thought you knew about the Ottoman harem. Because once you understand the true nature of this golden cage, you'll never look at historical harems the same way again. The official version of the Ottoman harem presents it as a sophisticated institution that served important political and social functions within the empire. According to this sanitized narrative, the harem was essentially a royal household where the sultan's wives, concubines, and female relatives lived in comfort and security while contributing to the dynasty's continuation and political stability. The physical structure of the harem within Topkapi Palace is typically described as a marvel of Islamic architecture and interior design. Visitors today see beautiful courtyards with marble fountains, elaborately tiled walls, and intimate chambers decorated with precious fabrics and artwork. The official tours emphasize the luxury and refinement of these spaces, suggesting that their inhabitants lived lives of unprecedented comfort and cultural sophistication. The hierarchical structure of the harem is usually presented as a logical administrative system that provided order and advancement opportunities for its residents. At the top sat the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who wielded enormous political influence and oversaw the entire institution. Below her were the Sultan's official wives, the Kadın Efendi, who held formal titles and received generous allowances. The imperial concubines, or Iqbal, occupied the next level of the hierarchy. These women had caught the sultan's attention and borne him children, earning them elevated status and comfortable living conditions. Below them were the Gözde, women who had been noticed by the sultan but had not yet achieved intimate relations with him. At the bottom were the Asimi, novice women who were being trained in palace protocol and skills. This system is typically portrayed as offering genuine opportunities for advancement based on intelligence, beauty, and political acumen. Women could theoretically rise through the ranks based on their abilities, eventually achieving positions of real power and influence. The most successful could become mothers of future sultans, wielding authority that extended far beyond the harem walls. The educational aspects of harem life are often emphasized in official accounts. Women received training in music, poetry, embroidery, and other cultural accomplishments that were considered essential for refined Ottoman ladies. They learned multiple languages, studied Islamic theology, and developed skills that would serve them throughout their lives, whether they remained in the harem or were eventually married to high-ranking officials. The economic security provided by the harem system is another frequently cited benefit. Women who entered the imperial household were guaranteed food, shelter, medical care, and protection for the rest of their lives. Those who bore the sultan children received generous pensions and estates. Even those who never achieved high rank were assured of comfortable retirements with financial support from the imperial treasury. The cultural exchange facilitated by the harem is often praised as one of its most positive aspects. Women from across the empire and beyond brought their diverse backgrounds, languages, and traditions into the palace, creating a cosmopolitan environment that influenced Ottoman art, cuisine, and social customs. This cultural mixing is presented as evidence of the empire's tolerance and sophistication. The political influence wielded by successful harem women is typically portrayed as evidence of the opportunities available within the system. Figures like the Valid Sultan could influence imperial policy, control vast patronage networks, and shape the succession process. Their power is presented as a form of female empowerment that was rare in other contemporary societies. Even the recruitment process for the harem is often sanitized in official accounts. Young women are described as being selected for their beauty, intelligence, and potential for advancement rather than being captured or purchased. The implication is that many families were honored to have their daughters chosen for imperial service, and that the women themselves often welcomed the opportunities this selection provided. The religious aspects of harem life are usually presented in positive terms as well. The women received Islamic religious instruction, participated in charitable activities, and contributed to the spiritual life of the palace community. Their religious devotion is portrayed as evidence of the moral foundation underlying the entire system. This comfortable narrative suggests that while the harem certainly had its restrictions and challenges, it was fundamentally a benevolent institution that provided security, education, and advancement opportunities for women who might otherwise have faced much harsher circumstances in the broader society. The system is presented as a product of its time that should be understood within its historical context rather than judged by modern standards. But what if this entire romanticized version is a carefully constructed lie designed to hide the most systematic program of sexual exploitation in recorded history? The reality of the Ottoman harem began with industrial-scale human trafficking that reached into every corner of the known world. The women who filled Topkapi Palace weren't volunteers seeking opportunity. They were kidnapped children whose families had been murdered, war captives whose villages had been destroyed, and purchased slaves whose previous owners had decided they were more valuable as currency than as human beings. The recruitment process was managed by specialized slave traders who operated networks spanning from the Caucasus Mountains to the Sudan. These traffickers didn't simply acquire women randomly. They were given specific orders for girls with particular physical characteristics, ethnic backgrounds, and estimated ages. The Ottoman court had developed detailed preferences for different types of women based on their intended functions within the harem hierarchy. Circassian girls were particularly prized for their fair skin and light eyes, qualities that were considered especially beautiful in Ottoman aesthetic standards. These children were often sold by their own families during times of economic hardship, but many were simply kidnapped during raids specifically organized to supply the slave markets. The journey from the Caucasus to Istanbul involved weeks of travel in conditions designed to break the girls' spirits before they even reached the palace. African women were acquired through equally brutal means, often captured during military campaigns that were as much about slave acquisition as territorial expansion. The trans-Saharan slave routes that supplied the Ottoman Empire with African women involved forced marches across desert terrain that killed significant percentages of the captives before they reached the markets. But perhaps most disturbing was the systematic recruitment of Christian children through the Devshirme system. While the boys were destined for the Janissary military corps, the girls were evaluated for potential harem service based on their physical appearance and perceived intelligence. The girls were given new names, forbidden to speak their native languages, and subjected to intensive indoctrination designed to make them forget their families and embrace their new roles as imperial property. The physical conditioning was equally systematic and equally brutal. Girls who showed any signs of resistance were subjected to beatings, starvation, and sexual assault designed to demonstrate their complete powerlessness. Those who attempted to escape were mutilated in ways that would serve as permanent reminders of the consequences of disobedience, while also making them less likely to attempt future escapes. The sexual initiation process was perhaps the most psychologically destructive aspect of the conditioning program. Young ladies were subjected to elaborate rituals designed to prepare them for sexual service. But rather than being sympathetic to the girls' suffering, many eunuchs became enthusiastic enforcers of the system that had destroyed their own lives, taking sadistic pleasure in inflicting similar trauma on new victims. The competitive structure within the harem wasn't a gentle contest for attention and advancement. It was a gladiatorial system where women were pitted against each other in increasingly desperate struggles for survival. Those who failed to advance through the hierarchy faced lives of sexual service to lower-ranking palace officials, assignment to provincial harems, or simply disposal through methods that the archives still refuse to reveal. The pregnancy and childbirth experiences of harem women reveal the true nature of the system most clearly. Women weren't cherished mothers-to-be, but breeding stock whose only value lay in their ability to produce healthy children for the dynasty. Those who miscarried or bore daughters were often discarded, while those who produced sons found themselves trapped in even more complex webs of political intrigue and violence. The infanticide practices within the harem were systematic and routine, with unwanted children being eliminated through methods that ranged from immediate strangulation to more prolonged forms of killing that allowed palace officials to study the effects of different techniques. The mothers were forced to participate in these murders, often personally killing their own children to demonstrate their loyalty to the system. Now let me tell you the story of Gulbahar Hatun, a woman whose life perfectly illustrates how the harem system functioned as a machine for destroying human souls while maintaining the facade of luxury and opportunity. Her biography reveals the true cost of life in the golden cage and shows how even the most successful harem women remained prisoners until their deaths. Gulbahar Hatun was born around 1467 in a small village in what is now Georgia, the daughter of a Christian merchant family that had prospered through trade with Ottoman territories. Her childhood was comfortable and secure, surrounded by loving parents and siblings in a community where she was known for her intelligence, musical ability, and striking beauty. That security ended abruptly when she was 14, and Ottoman raiders swept through her region during a minor military campaign. The raid wasn't motivated by strategic considerations, but by the need to acquire fresh slaves for the imperial household. Gulbahar watched her parents and brothers murdered before her eyes, then was chained with other surviving girls for the journey to Istanbul. The forced march to the capital took 3 weeks and served as the first phase of her psychological conditioning. The girls were deliberately underfed, inadequately clothed, and subjected to regular sexual assaults by their guards. Those who showed signs of resistance were beaten unconscious, while those who attempted escape were killed in front of the others as object lessons. Upon arrival at the slave markets, Gulbahar underwent the humiliating process of physical examination by potential buyers. She was stripped naked, examined for signs of disease or previous sexual activity, and evaluated like livestock based on her estimated breeding potential and sexual attractiveness. The imperial agents who eventually purchased her were known for their expertise in selecting girls who could be successfully conditioned for harem service. Her first months in Topkapi Palace were designed to complete the destruction of her previous identity. She was given a new name, forbidden to speak Georgian or practice Christianity, and subjected to intensive training in Islamic theology and Ottoman court protocol. Any reference to her former life resulted in severe punishment, including beatings and periods of solitary confinement in chambers designed to produce psychological breakdown. The sexual conditioning began gradually but inexorably. Gulbahar was first required to serve at male-only gatherings where she would be groped and sexually humiliated while being trained to accept such treatment as normal. She was then subjected to increasingly intimate forms of assault, disguised as educational experiences designed to prepare her for eventual service to the Sultan. But Gulbahar's real education occurred through witnessing what happened to other girls who resisted the conditioning process. She watched as rebellious newcomers were subjected to torture sessions that were presented as medical treatments. She saw older women who had fallen from favor mysteriously disappear, never to be mentioned again. She learned that survival required not just compliance, but enthusiasm for her own exploitation. The psychological pressure was intensified through the competitive structure that pitted the women against each other in increasingly desperate attempts to gain favor. Gulbahar quickly learned that friendships were dangerous liabilities that could be exploited by rivals seeking to eliminate competition. Trust became impossible in an environment where every confidence shared could be used as a weapon. Her first sexual encounter with Sultan Bayezid II was the culmination of months of preparation involving other palace officials who had tested her responses and trained her in techniques designed to maximize the Sultan's pleasure while minimizing her own psychological resistance. The encounter itself was witnessed by eunuchs who took detailed notes on her performance for future reference. But rather than feeling honored by the Sultan's attention, Gulbahar experienced the encounter as the final destruction of whatever remained of her original identity. The girl who had once sung in a Georgian church choir was now a sexual servant whose body belonged entirely to a man she had been conditioned to worship despite her terror of him. The pregnancy that resulted from this encounter trapped Gulbahar in an even more complex web of palace intrigue. Carrying a potential heir made her valuable enough to attract the attention of other harem women who saw her as either a useful ally or a dangerous rival. She was simultaneously protected and threatened by women who understood that their own survival might depend on the fate of her unborn child. The birth of her son Selim in 1470 elevated Gulbahar's status within the harem hierarchy, but also made her a target for elimination by rival mothers whose own sons represented alternative succession possibilities. She was forced to participate in plots against other women while constantly guarding against similar plots directed against herself and her child. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Gulbahar's experience was being forced to raise her son within the same system that had destroyed her own childhood. She had to train Selim to see the harem as normal, to accept the sexual exploitation of women as natural, and to prepare himself for the possibility that he might need to eliminate his own brothers to secure his position as heir. The ultimate irony of Gulbahar's story came when her son Selim eventually became Sultan Selim I and proved himself to be one of the most brutal rulers in Ottoman history. The woman who had been destroyed by the imperial system had successfully raised a son who would expand and perfect that system's capacity for violence and exploitation. This brings us to the darkest secret of the Ottoman harem system: the systematic elimination of inconvenient women through methods so sophisticated that they left no trace in the official records and created the illusion that women simply vanished when they were no longer useful to the imperial household. The triggering event for these elimination campaigns was typically the death of a sultan, which created immediate succession crises that required the rapid consolidation of power around the new ruler. Any women associated with rival claimants to the throne represented potential threats that needed to be neutralized quickly and quietly. The methods used were designed to avoid the obvious violence that might create martyrs or inspire resistance among the remaining harem population. Instead of public executions, the elimination process relied on techniques that could be disguised as natural deaths, accidents, or voluntary departures from the palace. Poisoning was the most common method, administered through foods, cosmetics, or incense that would cause symptoms resembling common illnesses. The palace maintained expert poisoners who could produce deaths that would occur days or weeks after the initial administration, making it impossible to trace the cause back to any specific individual or event. But the most psychologically effective elimination method was the systematic use of other harem women as executioners. Women who had been rivals of the condemned would be given opportunities to administer fatal doses of poison, strangle victims during supposedly friendly embraces, or arrange accidents that would eliminate their competition while demonstrating their loyalty to the new regime. The disposal of bodies was equally systematic and equally designed to maintain the illusion that nothing violent had occurred. Victims would be declared to have died of natural causes, and their bodies would be buried in unmarked graves within the palace grounds or disposed of in ways that left no physical evidence of their existence. The children of eliminated women faced even more horrific fates. Male children who might represent future succession threats were typically strangled immediately after their mothers' deaths. Female children were often sold into slavery or distributed as gifts to provincial officials, effectively disappearing from the historical record. But perhaps most disturbing was the systematic use of elimination campaigns as opportunities for sexual violence against women who were already condemned to death. Eunuchs and other palace officials would subject doomed women to extended periods of rape and torture, understanding that their victims would never survive to report these crimes. The aftermath of Sultan Mehmed, the third accession in 1595, provides the most documented example of these systematic elimination campaigns. Within weeks of his father's death, 19 of Mehmed's brothers were strangled with silk cords, and their mothers and associated women were systematically eliminated through various methods designed to look like natural causes or voluntary departures. The women chosen for elimination were subjected to elaborate psychological torture designed to break their will to resist. They would be informed that their children had already been killed, that their families outside the palace had been executed, and that cooperation in their own deaths was the only way to prevent even worse fates from befalling anyone associated with them. Some women were offered the opportunity to commit suicide as a more honorable alternative to execution, but these suicides were carefully supervised to ensure that they actually occurred and that the deaths appeared voluntary to any potential witnesses. The methods used ranged from poisoning to strangulation, but all were designed to leave bodies that showed no obvious signs of violence. The most psychologically devastating aspect of these elimination campaigns was how they were presented to the surviving harem population. The disappearances were explained as evidence of the new sultan's mercy, with stories circulated about how the departed women had been granted comfortable retirements in provincial cities or had been married to worthy officials who would provide for them. The surviving women were required to express gratitude for these supposedly merciful arrangements while knowing perfectly well that their former companions had been murdered. This forced complicity in obvious lies served to further condition the survivors to accept whatever explanations were provided for future disappearances. The sexual dimension of these elimination campaigns was particularly important for maintaining control over the surviving population. Women who witnessed the rape and torture of condemned victims understood that similar fates awaited anyone who showed signs of resistance or disloyalty to the new regime. The eunuchs who supervised these elimination campaigns were themselves products of the same system, men who had been castrated and conditioned to serve imperial interests without question. But their participation in the systematic murder of women they had known intimately reveals how completely the palace system had destroyed normal human empathy and moral judgment. The final phase of each elimination campaign involved the systematic destruction of any evidence that the eliminated women had ever existed. Their personal possessions were redistributed, their quarters were reassigned, and their names were literally erased from palace records. Within months, it was as if they had never lived at all. The long-term psychological effects of witnessing these systematic elimination campaigns were profound and lasting. Surviving harem women developed the extreme risk aversion and desperate loyalty that characterized palace culture for centuries. They learned that the only safety lay in complete submission to the current regime and enthusiastic participation in whatever crimes that regime might require. The techniques perfected during these harem elimination campaigns were later adapted for use throughout the Ottoman Empire whenever political consolidation required the elimination of potential threats. The methods developed for murdering inconvenient women proved equally effective for eliminating rebellious governors, troublesome religious leaders, and anyone else who posed challenges to imperial authority. Today, more than a century after the Ottoman Empire's collapse, the full documentation of these systematic elimination campaigns remains locked in archives that researchers cannot access. Turkish authorities continue to restrict access to palace records from certain periods, claiming that full disclosure might damage Turkey's international reputation or inflame ethnic tensions. Recent archaeological investigations at Topkapi Palace have uncovered evidence that supports the most disturbing accounts of harem violence. Excavations have revealed unmarked burial sites containing the remains of numerous women and children, many showing signs of violent death that contradicts the official records claiming natural causes. The discovery of specialized rooms within the harem complex that appear designed for torture and execution has been particularly significant. These chambers were carefully concealed from the areas shown to visitors and dignitaries, but their function becomes clear when examined in light of the documentary evidence about elimination campaigns. Perhaps most importantly, understanding the true nature of the Ottoman harem reveals patterns of sexual exploitation and institutional violence that persist in various forms throughout the modern world. The techniques developed for conditioning kidnapped children into willing sexual servants have been adapted by contemporary human trafficking operations that continue to destroy lives on a global scale. The romanticized image of the harem that pervades popular culture serves to obscure these ongoing crimes by making sexual slavery seem exotic and glamorous rather than recognizing it as systematic torture and murder. The same fantasies that make Ottoman harems seem appealing also make it easier to ignore the reality of modern sexual trafficking and exploitation. The psychological conditioning techniques pioneered in places like Topkapi Palace continue to influence how authoritarian systems control populations through the systematic destruction of individual identity and the creation of competitive hierarchies that prevent collective resistance. Understanding how these techniques were developed and implemented provides insight into how similar systems operate today. If this investigation into the true nature of the Ottoman harem has revealed the gap between historical fantasy and documented reality, subscribe to this channel for more examinations of how romanticized narratives conceal systematic violence and exploitation. And let me know in the comments which other historical institutions you think deserve similar scrutiny. Because understanding how the past really worked is essential for recognizing and confronting similar patterns